Welcome to the OCO webinar series. In today's webinar, we will discuss the impact that chronic stress has on the mind and body. As caregivers frequently experience stress, anxiety, depression, and loneliness, mindfulness helps us stay in the present so that we can better manage negative emotions and build emotional strength. This in turn allows us to care for our loved ones more effectively. Today's session will encourage participants to identify the ingredients of their stress and understand how the experience of stress is manifested in our bodies. Our speaker today will provide an overview of mindfulness meditation, and we will also be invited to engage in a short sitting practice before opening the floor for Q&A. I am Indira Fernando, and I will be moderating this webinar today. I am one of the program leads here at the Ontario Caregiver Organization. I am pleased to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Alexandra Fiocco. Dr. Fiocco is an associate professor and director of the Stress and Healthy Aging Research Laboratory at Ryerson University. Her research focuses on the impact of stress and lifestyle behaviors on emotional and cognitive well-being in later adulthood. She has been practicing mindfulness meditation for 10 years, has engaged in mindfulness research for 6 years, and is a qualified teacher of mindfulness-based stress reduction as defined by the University of California, San Diego Mindfulness-Based Professional Training Institute. Dr. Fiocco, thank you for joining us today.
So first, I would love to thank the Ontario Caregiver Organization for inviting me to present today on cultivating mindfulness for well-being among caregivers. And so over the past few years, I have been engaging in research that examines the benefits of mindfulness meditation for older adults, including older caregivers of persons with neurodegenerative disease. So some of the findings that I'll present today stems from that line of research, as well as the research that we see in the literature and by my colleagues. So before I go into today's presentation, I'd like to just share this slide with everyone. For those of you who have traveled via air before, and we haven't been doing it very much recently in the midst of COVID. But for those who are frequent flyers, we're sort of aware of some of the standard practices that go on before taking off. And so one of those practices is that there is the flight attendant who kind of sets out the rules and regulations of best practice for safety. And so we were told about the importance of wearing our seatbelt. We're told about the importance of knowing where the exit signs are and the exit doors. And then we're also told what to do when cabin pressure drops in the plane. And so one of those things is that, yes, an oxygen mask will fall from the ceiling above our chair. And most importantly, we're told to place the oxygen mask on ourselves before placing it on a small child or before assisting someone else who may be in need. And this is a perfect example of the importance of self-care before we can even start thinking about caring for another individual. Unfortunately, this is largely lost on us within our society. This notion of self-care is often seen as something that's selfish and not necessarily important. So we really need to realize the importance of self-care, especially for individuals who are in a caregiver role. So here's a bit of a roadmap for today. So I'll begin by talking about the family caregiver, and I will present a bit of research suggesting that many caregivers experience chronic stress, and chronic stress is associated with an increased risk for the development of stress-related ailments. I'll then talk about the stress response. So what does the stress response look like? What happens in the body when we're faced with a stressor or a threat in our environment? I'll then talk about the ingredients of stress. And I always tell my students and participants in my mindfulness groups that before we can even start to discuss stress management tools, that it's important to be able to first recognize when stress arises in the body, but also be able to identify the stressors or the ingredients that make us perceive something as being stressful. Then I'll go in to briefly talk about mindfulness meditation, as well as how mindfulness meditation may be used as a tool to cultivate resilience in caregivers. And then hopefully there will be time for a brief practice. Perhaps we'll do the 3-minute breathing space before moving into the Q&A segment of today's session. So let's begin. The family caregiver or informal caregiver, often also called the unpaid caregiver. These are individuals who provide ongoing care and assistance for loved ones without pay. And in Canada, according to Statistics Canada, there are about 8 million informal caregivers. This estimate was derived from a 2012 Stats Canada review. So we're likely seeing an increase, especially in the context of an aging population. And of course, we also see that there are many individuals, in this case, 6 million Canadians, who provide care to an older adult. So perhaps a spouse or an aging parent. According to Statistics Canada, about 24% of caregivers are aged between 45 years and 54. But I'd also like to show that about 12% of caregivers are aged 65 years and older. And in fact, this percentage will likely rise again in the context of an aging population. More women find themselves in the caregiver role than men, although there has been a rise in men providing care. And again, I'm always referring to this aging population that we are experiencing. And we know that women are at increased risk of developing dementia, such as Alzheimer's disease. So we likely will see more spouses, males in a spousal role, caring for their wife. And I'd like to also just direct your attention to this graph on the right. And this graph depicts the number of hours per week engaging in the caregiver role according to the relationship with the care recipient. And so what we see is that spouses, that their caregiver role entails significantly more hours of care compared to some of these other relationships. Also, about 1 in 10 caregivers spend about 30+ hours a week in the caregiver role. Why this is important is because research does show that there's this direct correlation between the number of hours engaging in the caregiver role and the amount of distress that is perceived among the caregiver. Although there are individual differences in the experience of stress as a caregiver, according to Statistics Canada, about 40% of caregivers rate their stress as high to very high. Now, if we look at the literature examining caregivers relative to non-caregiver peers, what the research shows is that compared to non-caregivers, family caregivers, are at significantly increased risk for the development of a number of stress-related ailments, including depression, anxiety, chronic fatigue, sleep problems, poor health-related quality of life, higher blood pressure. They're also at a 6-fold increased risk for the development of dementia compared to non-caregiver spouses. Also, caregivers tend to report a higher frequency of visits to their physician, as well as more prescribed medication. So overall, what the literature suggests is that being in the caregiver role for some may be an experience of chronic stress, and chronic stress within the body then increases risk for some of these stress-related ailments. So let's talk about stress and the impact of stress on the body. So here we have a picture of a very angry, roaring bear. And I'd like you to imagine that you are confronted by this very angry, probably hungry bear. And what would you do? What would be your experience? I'm sure many of you would probably feel fear. There would be the emotion of fear, and the behavior would probably be something like, running away and screaming. So what does that look like in the body? Essentially, when faced with an absolute stressor, such as this bear, and we call it an absolute stressor because this is a stressor that, the universal experience would be that of fear and that of running away. And we would all mount a stress response when faced with this bear. So the acute stress response, which we also call the fight or flight response, is this very characteristic change in our physiological system in response to an absolute threat. And our stress response system is very adaptive. The reason why we're here today is because our ancestors had a fabulous stress response. If we did not have an adaptive stress response, then we would not be able to survive some of these absolute stressors, such as being confronted by this angry bear, or running out of a burning building, or running out of the middle of the street to protect ourselves from, say, a car that's running through a red light. So our stress systems are very important. They're there for survival. So what happens when we are confronted by an absolute stressor or a threat in our environment, such as this angry bear? What happens is that there's activation of two stress-sensitive systems. The sympathetic adrenal medullary, or SAM axis, is activated, followed by activation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA axis. And these two systems act together to allow for this real beautiful orchestrated change in our physiological milieu. So what happens is that there are a number of physiological changes that happen, and you could probably just close your eyes and imagine, yes, these are things that happen if I'm confronted by a threat in my environment. So what happens is that the pupils become dilated, more light comes in, and we're really vigilant on the threats that we have to manage that's in front of us. We also see that our breathing changes, so the breath becomes very quick, and there's also shallow breath that occurs. Also, our heartbeat goes a lot faster, so the heart beats faster and harder. We also see a change in our blood pressure, so blood pressure increases as our major blood vessels dilate. Another thing is that a lot of energy is brought to our muscles, and so there might be trembling that occurs in the muscles, but glucose is sent to our muscles to ensure that we can fight or flee from this threat. There are also a number of changes that occur that sort of shut down certain systems. So for example, salivary flow decreases, and this also affects the digestive system. And the reason why is because, well, if you think about it, it's not important to digest a meal when you're trying to run away from the bear and save your life. The last thing you need to do is digest your food or engage in, say, reproductive behaviors. So digestive system, reproductive system, these things tend to shut down while our cardiovasculature rises in response to the stress. Now, this is adaptive. We need this to happen in order to survive. The problem is that in today's society, we're not responding to these absolute stressors. These absolute stressors don't happen very frequently, if at all. And so it's not every day or every moment of the day that you are running away from a bear or running out of a burning building. However, every day we are faced with what we call relative stressors. And these are stressors, they're called relative because there are individual differences in whether or not we will react or mount a stress response to these stressors. So for example, interpersonal stress, interpersonal tension, communication. So for example, getting into a fight with a loved one, perhaps the care recipient, that these situations may lead to a mounting of the stress response. Also, job stress, role demand. So I'm looking at this woman in this picture, and it looks like she's a doctor. There are a lot of people are asking her for tasks to be completed, and perhaps this woman is also a sandwich generation where she's caring for her children at home as well as caring for an aging parent. So there are a number of things going on that perhaps aggregate, and each of these stressors may actually lead to mounting a stress response. There are also situations that we really do see individual differences here. Standing in line. So here we have a gentleman, he's standing in line, he wants to buy his toilet paper, and perhaps it's a very long lineup. So some people who have to wait in line in long lineups, they start to feel very frustrated. There's sort of this hurriedness, this hurried response. Perhaps he's looking in front, wondering what's taking so long. Is that person who's paying fumbling with their change? Have they striked up a conversation with the cashier? And so these thoughts and emotions may actually lead to a stress response simply by standing in a grocery line. There's also traffic. We know that there's something called road rage. I'm sure many of us have perhaps been on the 401 or on a similar highway where we're bumper to bumper traffic. And so again, these are situations that are relative stressors. Some of us may mount a stress response as a reaction to the road. Now, it's also interesting because some of these relative stressors may not even be from external situations. These can be internal situations that occur. So our brain can be really wonderful at ruminating about the past, so having our top 10 hits kind of circulate in our mind on and on about that conversation that we had and we wish we said this or that, or perhaps we're worrying about the future. In these cases, again, we may mount a stress response, even though there's no danger that we're being faced. Our brain cannot tell the difference. Now, what happens is that by reacting daily and frequently to these relevant stressors, what happens is that we're continuously activating our stress response. And over time, this can have a wear and tear in our system. And this is what we call allostatic load. So allostatic load is the wear and tear of our physiological systems due to the frequent activation of our stress-sensitive systems. So for this reason, we really want to be cognizant of how often are we really activating a stress response in the body, and can we really be in tune with that activation? I'd also like to talk about the ingredients to stress. So I always tell my students that, again, before we can manage stress, we have to recognize stress in the body, but we also need to identify why we are perceiving a situation as stressful. And so through various, throughout the years, researchers have developed 4 ingredients or have found 4 ingredients that contribute to the experience of something being stressful. And together these ingredients spell the word stun. And you only need one of these ingredients to mount a stress response. And the more ingredients you have, you're more likely to mount a stress response. And perhaps you're also going to find it more difficult to recover from this stress response. So not only is the reactivity important, but the recovery period is really important as well, because some of us maintain that high level of reactivity for a long period of time. And this is really putting pressure on our stress sensitive systems and the interconnected systems. So if we could recover faster, that's also better for our well-being. So just thinking about some of these ingredients, the first is sense of control is low. And I'm sure that you could imagine this perhaps in the caregiver role itself. In speaking and working with some of the family caregivers who have participated in my research program, a lot of them will talk about the fact that there was no control, there was no choice, that being a caregiver was thrusted upon them, and that they have no control over their loved one's diagnosis or the trajectory of that diagnosis. So sense of control is low. And so it's likely that with a lack of control or a sense that there is no control over the situation, that we may end up mounting a stress response. The second ingredient is threat to ego. And so what this means is that situations where there is an evaluative threat, you feel like you're being evaluated, this will create a tendency for one to experience a stress response. So in terms of evaluative threat, you could think about, are people evaluating me and my role as a caregiver? Do people think that I'm doing a good enough job? Sometimes this evaluative threat is actually internalized, that we tell ourselves, I'm not good enough, I'm not doing a good enough job. We end up shoulding ourselves a lot. So I should be doing this, I should be doing that. All of this leads to this negative evaluation or a threat of evaluation. And this is also a second very potent ingredient that will make a situation be perceived as stressful and mount a stress response. Unpredictability is the third ingredient. And so again, in this case, if we think about the unpredictability of being a caregiver and not being able to predict the care recipient's behavior, so the caregivers who I worked with, they were older caregivers of a loved one with a neurodegenerative disease such as dementia or Alzheimer's disease, and they often talked about the unpredictability of the behavior that was expressed by their loved one, that it would change from moment to moment or from day to day. So that unpredictability, not being able to tell what will happen in each passing moment, can be very stressful for an individual and therefore mount a stress response. And the last ingredient is novelty. And again, you could think about when you first found yourself in the caregiver role, the amount of information that you had to look into or to learn, or perhaps you're still in that process of learning everything that there is to learn about the condition of your loved one, or what it means to be a caregiver, and the various resources and tools that you need as a caregiver. That again, this in itself can be an ingredient that results in mounting a stress response. Now, of course, what's also important to recognize is that these ingredients will look different for all of us. So stress is in the eye of the beholder. And being a caregiver does not necessarily equate to stress and disease. So, research does show that the perception of stress is individualistic. We all evaluate situations, events, stimuli in our environment very differently. But what is important to remember is that although we cannot control what happens in our lives, we can control to some extent how we choose to respond to those events or situations or stimuli. So again, not every caregiver will experience distress in their caregiver role. There are individual differences. And there's quite a bit of research to actually support these individual difference characteristics among caregivers. And so in research that has examined what factors are associated with resilience among caregivers, well, there are a few characteristics. From this 2006 study, it was found that being a resilient caregiver was associated with certain qualities or attributes such as patience and compassion, inner strength of the caregiver, as well as inner strength of the care recipient. In this case, the care recipient was always the spouse of the caregiver. So again, these qualities were very important to help the caregiver be resilient. Also, in a qualitative study that examined 17 family caregivers from Thailand, it was found that affection from the care recipient and encouragement from the wider community was important to have a positive experience as a caregiver. As well, showing gratitude and understanding that suffering is part of life help these caregivers to manage their stress. And in brackets, I wrote Buddhist teachings here. And this is sort of leading us into mindfulness meditation. And so you've noticed that perhaps I've highlighted certain characteristics: patience, compassion, gratitude, suffering. These are attributes or attitudes that we cultivate in the practice of mindfulness meditation. So let's move into mindfulness meditation. So why practice mindfulness meditation? Why is it important, really for anyone, but I think especially caregivers, that this can be an important tool to develop? And so what we know is that the practice of mindfulness meditation helps us to cultivate the skill to respond in the face of stress. The cultivation of mindfulness helps us to be skillful responders to our environment. And I'd like to share this wonderful quote by Viktor Frankl, who was a Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist. And he was not a mindfulness practitioner, but this quote really does align with the construct or concept of mindfulness, that between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. This is a wonderful quote. And so essentially what we're talking about here we have stimulus in red, an arrow leading to a response. Now, usually if there is some stressful stimulus in our environment, there is often a reactivity. We react. It's autonomic, it's automatic. And sometimes those automatic or reflexive reactivity responses, or reactivity in itself, can have some negative consequences. You could think about perhaps if you're feeling very frustrated and your loved one says something and perhaps you snap right back at them. because you yourself are in a state of high level of distress. And so that is that automatic reaction, is snapping. So what we do in the practice of mindfulness, when we're cultivating mindfulness, we use what we call the mindful pause. And that mindful pause is the space that Viktor Frankl was speaking of. So within this space, we bring the practice of mindfulness. So what is mindfulness? Well, before I talk about what mindfulness is, I want to stress what mindfulness meditation is not. It's not a religious ritual, so you could practice mindfulness meditation regardless of what your religious beliefs or background is. Mindfulness meditation is not mystical, so we do not have to, travel to the top of a mountain and sit in lotus posture and, have this lovely mantra as the sunset goes down. So again, as depicted in this picture, it's not mystical. There is evidence to support the practice of mindfulness. We could bring a secular view to it. Also importantly, mindfulness meditation is not a quick fix. So it doesn't matter if you read a number of books on mindfulness meditation, if you attend a session on mindfulness meditation. Mindfulness meditation is a skill. Mindfulness is a skill that needs to be cultivated every single day. So if you want to cultivate mindfulness, if you want to develop the skill, it's like developing any other skill. If you want to be a great tennis player, if you want to be a great golf player or a flautist, I don't know, I'm coming up with these examples. These are things that you have to practice every single day in order to develop that skill. It's the same thing with mindfulness. Finally, also, I have to stress that mindfulness meditation, and when we're engaging in the meditation practice, we're not training to sit still. We're not training to be statues. We're also not training to zone out of our current situation or to escape from our current situation. There are stress response practices, there are imagery practices that you can engage in where, we're not imagining that we're on a beach with a daiquiri in our hand. What we're doing is we are being present for momentary experiences as they arise. And some of those momentary experiences may not be pleasant. So we are bringing awareness to positive, neutral, and perhaps negative experiences, thoughts, emotions as they arise in the present moment. So it's quite different from some of these relaxation responses. I also would love to share this quote with you by Sharon Salzberg. So as Sharon says, we don't meditate to get better at meditating, we meditate to get better at life. So again, and I always tell this to my students and participants who engage in the mindfulness program, is that it really doesn't matter how long you could sit on the meditation cushion, on the mat. It doesn't matter how great you are within the meditation practice. If you cannot extend that practice to your everyday life, then the practice is sort of being missed. And the importance of the practice and the benefits of the practice are really being missed. So what is mindfulness meditation? Well, when we define mindfulness, there are various definitions that we could use. I like to use the one that was proposed by Jon Kabat-Zinn, who is actually the individual who brought mindfulness meditation to the West in the form of an 8-week program, the Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction Program, or MBSR program. And so Jon Kabat-Zinn and many others now also define mindfulness as the skill of paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, with an accepting attitude. And I highlight attitude. Attitude is essential. And we could link this definition to the 3 pillars or axioms of mindfulness, which is intention, attention, and attitude. So the intention is that we're doing this on purpose. There is purpose in life. So every day we wake up with an intention. We wake up with a goal of what is that day going to look like? Similarly, with intention, how do we want to align our life? What are our beliefs? What is most important to us? And how do we want to live our life accordingly? And so we set an intention. We're doing this on purpose. We're not on automatic pilot. We are attending to something on purpose. The second piece is attention. So in this case, in the practice, we are focusing our attention to an anchor to present moment experience. So whether that's the breath, whether it's sensations in the body, whether it's sound, thoughts, we are training our attention. And so this focused attention piece does lead to changes in the brain. And why the attention piece is so important is that by training our attentional control, we are also impacting our ability to effectively engage in emotion regulation, which is very important for wellness. And the last piece, the last pillar, is that of attitude. And so again, you know, you could sit and focus on negative thoughts. You could sit and focus on ruminative thoughts, on depressive thoughts. And if that's what you practice, then that grows stronger. So in this case, when we are practicing mindfulness meditation, we're practicing with an accepting attitude, we're practicing non-judgment or suspending judgment, we're practicing patience, letting go, we're also practicing compassion. And so these are the attitudes that we cultivate in the practice of mindfulness. And so this is the thing, is that how do we practice? How do we become skillful at mindfulness? Well, this is how, through the practice of meditation. So meditation is how we cultivate the skill of mindfulness. Okay, so here we just have a list of the mindful attitudes that we cultivate in the program and that we continue to do even after the program. And I've highlighted acceptance and compassion and loving kindness. In particular, this sort of links back to that research that I told you about, that really suggests that there are certain attitudes or certain attributes or characteristics that are associated with resilience among family caregivers. So these are attributes, these are characteristics that we purposely cultivate in the practice of mindfulness meditation. It's also important to know that what we practice grows stronger. So we know through research that experience changes the brain. Our brains are very plastic throughout our entire lifespan. And so we see this in the research looking at physical exercise and how that changes the brain, nutrition, engaging in cognitive stimulating activities. These things change the brain. Well, also we see that the practice of mindfulness meditation significantly changes the brain. And what we know is that what you practice grows stronger. So again, if you practice anger, anger will grow. Connectivity in the brain that is associated with anger, aggression, hostility, anxiety, if that's what we practice every day, those connections in the brain will grow. However, if we choose to practice compassion, loving kindness, acceptance, these connections in the brain will grow. And there is quite a bit of research stemming from imaging studies that has shown that the practice of mindfulness meditation leads to brain structure changes as well as function in the brain. So structures such as the hippocampus, which is important for learning memory and is also implicated in the stress response, that this structure has been shown to actually grow. We also see cortical thickening following mindfulness meditation. We see changes in connectivity in the brain. And so, for example, the prefrontal cortex gets better at dampening amygdala activity, the amygdala, which is our fear center, and essentially is activated in the response to fear. So our prefrontal cortex becomes a lot better at dampening that amygdala activity. So there's quite a bit of research to show that the practice of mindfulness does change the brain in terms of structure and in terms of function. Now, this research has not been conducted in caregivers per se. It's been conducted in a range of other populations, including clinical populations, as well as healthy populations in the community. With respect to mindfulness for caregivers in particular, there's quite a bit of research that suggests benefit. So, for example, research shows that engaging in mindfulness meditation for caregivers is associated with a number of benefits that in terms of decreasing stress-related health ailments, including depression, stress, anxiety, feeling isolated, sleep problems, cognitive health, as well as health-related quality of life. Now remember, these are all stress-related health ailments. So we see that in family caregivers, those who engage in the practice. And also I want to stress that the findings here that I'm highlighting come from studies that used an active control condition. So just as an example, my own research is also listed here, where if you compare caregivers who engage in an 8-week MBSR session, mindfulness program, versus older caregivers who were randomized to a psychoeducation social support group. And we often use that active control condition because this is generally what we see in terms of available programming in our community. And so what is shown is that compared to these active control conditions, engaging in mindfulness is associated with reductions in depression and stress. And I also want to say that the most robust findings have been for depression and stress. And with respect to some of the other findings, the literature is a little mixed. And that's because, again, there are a lot of individual differences in terms of engaging in the practice and really internalizing the practice. Also, what's important is that these studies do focus on the caregiver, and my own research focuses on the caregiver. And when bringing these programs to the community, I have been asked to perhaps include dyads, so including the care recipient and the caregiver in my mindfulness sessions. And this is usually a go-to. And I often choose not to do that. I choose to focus on the caregiver only. And because the reason why is because in research, and I think also in the healthcare system, the focus has always been on the care recipient. In the work that I do with caregivers of persons with neurodegeneration, the focus is always on the person with dementia or the person with Parkinson's. And so again, we are not focusing on the caregiver in these cases, and we're always putting the caregiver second. So I feel that it really is important that for these interventions to be effective, they need to focus on the caregiver only. And recently, kind of looking into this, I can see that there's research to support this sort of intuition that I have, in that studies that have incorporated the patient caregiver dyads in their mindfulness groups have shown the least significant effects for caregivers. And it makes sense, because as soon as the care recipient is brought into this intervention, the focus will be on the care recipient and not the caregiver. So we really have to create space for the caregiver to, in a sense, really force them in a way to start to engage in these self-care thoughts and behaviors. Now, I'd also just like to share a few quotes that stem from my research in caregivers. And the reason why is because I'm just kind of presenting here a list of health outcomes, but I always like to give a voice to my caregivers. And so some of the themes that were derived from the interview data following my randomized controlled trial with caregivers include things such as, self-care, the importance of self-care. So for example, one participant said, "It forced me to concentrate on me, my needs." Another person said, "It helped me to understand that I can't do everything. I need to take time for myself." Now, again, when we're looking at these quotes, we're thinking, yes, of course, but it's important to internalize these thoughts. It's important to internalize it so that you can actually engage in the behavior of self-care. Another theme that came up was that of acceptance and letting be. So one person said, "I am able to let things go better, more calmer in reacting and dealing with difficult situations." Another person said, "I have accepted my mother's situation. I am now able to spend quality time with my mom. I am less angry." This piece is really important because this participant was actually a trained nurse. And it just really shows that it doesn't matter necessarily what your background training is, even if you have training in healthcare, that it's a different situation when it's a loved one. If it's your spouse or your parent, the whole game changes. Another theme that came up was that of skill building. So it equipped me with techniques. I feel less panicked and anxious because I could remember to breathe and meditate briefly. These are new skills for me. Another caregiver said, "Gave me more confidence to handle things. I feel more centered in control." And then finally, of course, a lot of the caregivers appreciated the camaraderie and friendship that developed by participating in these groups. And it's not that they were always sharing stories in the groups, but it's simply understanding that you're not alone. And many caregivers feel isolated in their caregiver role. So it's knowing that they're not alone, and especially in this last quote here, friendship, camaraderie, learning to listen and not just hear, not feeling alone in this situation that has been thrust upon me. So again, it's understanding that often we don't choose to be a caregiver, but it's how are we going to accept that caregiver role. So what are we doing in this practice? And it really is a lifelong journey, the practice of mindfulness. And so what we're doing is we're moving from certain states of thoughts that we currently see in our society and sort of moving along a continuum. So for example, the notion of suffering is no one wants to suffer. And we try to resist suffering. We resist it, we suppress it because we don't want to feel bad about anything. But the problem is that that resistance in itself actually increases suffering. So what we're trying to move away from is this notion of this fear of suffering. And so this resistance and suppression of suffering. And over time, with the practice, we're trying to become more equanimous. We're trying to develop the sense of equanimity in that we are giving ourselves permission to feel and to explore and to be with any experience as it arises, whether it's negative, neutral, or positive, to sort of welcome them all while being even keeled, so with a calm mind. And that really is important in order to skillfully respond to events in our life. We're also moving away from this notion of permanence to impermanence. So in our culture, we don't deal very well with change. The most extreme case of change would be loss of a loved one, death. We do not deal very well. And the reason why is, again, there's this sort of this resistance to change and this insistence of there being permanence without realizing that life is forever changing. And so what we're doing in the practice is that we're moving away from this resisting of change to understanding the impermanence of life by accepting and appreciating the changingness in our life. And the final piece is that we are often selfing. We have this tendency to personalize events in our lives, and we're internalizing them. And we feel that, I only experience this pain. No one understands how I feel. And so as you can imagine, that ends up being quite isolating. We feel isolated in our feelings because there's that belief that no one is feeling what I'm feeling. So there's a lot of selfing going on. So with the practice, what we're doing is we're moving away from this sense of me, I, my pain, which is isolating, and moving to depersonalizing and normalizing the experience of pain and suffering. So from this me or isolation of my pain to understanding that it is really we, or understanding the universality of suffering. We all suffer. Everyone here today and in our environment has experienced joy, pain, and suffering. So it's important to really understand that and to internalize that. And I want to sort of end with this final note. And so again, through this practice, there's this wonderful quote by John Kabat-Zinn that says, as long as you're breathing, there's more right with you than wrong, no matter what is wrong. And, in our trajectory, in our life, it's important to know that there's always room for healing. We're not curing anything, but there's always room for healing. And that room for healing, that space for healing is there with us until we take our final breath. And so even to this day, when I'm feeling very overwhelmed, I always remind myself, I am breathing, I'm okay. So I'd like to now invite you to engage in a short sitting practice with me, and I am mindful of the time. So it'll just be a 3-minute breathing space, or a 3-step breathing space. And the 3-minute breathing space was actually developed through the MBCT, or Mindfulness-Based Cognitive Therapy program that was developed here in Toronto. And so I have this image here because I also want to stress that we don't have to sit with our legs crossed to engage in a sitting practice. We can sit in our chair, especially if we have lower back pain. It's important to really be aware of our sitting posture and to be kind to our body. And so what I invite you to do, and again, this is an invitation. If this is not of interest to you, please feel free to perhaps step out of the room or just to take a 3-minute break. Or to allow my words to sort of recede into the background. But if you are interested in this practice, then please join me by finding a sitting posture. And so when we're finding a sitting posture, we want to ensure that our feet are planted in the ground. And so this sense of groundedness from the soles of our feet that are pressing down into the ground. We can also sense the connectivity of our sits bones or our bum pressing down against the cushion, the chair, or whatever surface that we're sitting on. Taking a posture that is awake, and so finding that the back or spinal cord is straight, but at the same time not forcing the posture, and so still feeling relaxation in the posture. Allowing the palms of the hand to face down on your thighs, or allowing the hands to clasp in your lap, whatever is comfortable for you. And if it's comfortable, allowing the eyes to close, or if not, perhaps just allowing the eyes to unfocus, and simply allowing the eyelids to become very relaxed. And so once you find your sitting posture, the invitation is to bring awareness to current moment experiences. So in this moment, bring awareness to thoughts, feelings, and bodily sensations that are present in this moment. There might be a lot of thoughts that are going on. Perhaps there's a lot of information that's been taken in. Perhaps there are some emotions that are going on. Perhaps there are judgments. And so simply acknowledging what is present in this moment, creating space for them, whether they're positive or negative. And exploring any sensations that are present in this moment, sensations in the body. Becoming curious to the characteristics of these sensations, of temperature, weight, pressure, pulsation, tingling, dullness. And if there are any sensations that are unpleasant, a bit of tension in the body, or perhaps there's an itch that arises. Notice perhaps the tendency to want to react to the unpleasant sensation, the tendency to want to automatically scratch the itch or to shift the body to ease the tension. But the invitation is that if these uncomfortable sensations do arise, to see if we could create space and to use the breath to breathe in or breathe with the experience. And on the next breath, I invite you to shift your focus of attention and narrow it down to the breath. Focusing on each in-breath and each out-breath, wherever it resonates with you the most in the body, perhaps at the level of the belly, with the expansion and contraction of the abdomen wall. Perhaps at the level of the chest, with the rise and fall of the chest with every in-breath and out-breath. Perhaps at the level of the nostrils, with cool air entering nostrils and warm air leaving nostrils. And focusing attention on the breath as the anchor to present moment experience. Bringing a gentle curiosity to the qualities of each breath without manipulating it in any way. Is the breath quick or slow, deep or shallow, smooth or jagged? And on the next breath, I invite you to expand this awareness to the entire body, bringing awareness to the body from the top of the head all the way down to the toes. Bringing awareness to this body in this space, on this sitting surface. And then perhaps, if it's available, bringing awareness beyond the four walls of this space. Bringing awareness of the connectivity between this body, this space, and the beings and spaces beyond these four walls, extending perhaps to those on this platform today, as we sit here sharing an experience together. And perhaps if it's available, bringing this more spacious awareness into the next moments of the day as this practice comes to an end. So I invite you to take 3 deep breaths in through the nostrils and out through the mouth. And when you're ready, opening your eyes and coming back to the platform. And so I'd like to thank you for this practice, and again for providing me with today's platform just to give you some of these broad brushstrokes with respect to stress and the importance of the cultivation of mindfulness. Also in this slide deck, I have a few resources that will be shared with you, a few books giving you an introduction to mindfulness, some websites that provide free resources. And I also have an online community for the 50+ community called Our Mindful Society. And this includes a weekly informal mindfulness session for community members who are interested in the practice of mindfulness.
On behalf of all of us here in this virtual space today, this has been such a wonderful discussion, a very insightful, and I think you covered a lot of pieces where sometimes we can get stuck in how we can actually use mindfulness on a daily basis, because a lot of the times folks have tried it here and there or tried it and then there's gaps in that. But knowing that you can come back to the present moment, that you can acknowledge how you're feeling in that moment and still come back to your breath is really good to know that that is an anchor. So thank you for being so detailed. What a wonderful discussion. So thank you, Alexandra.